Good morning. My guest today is Mark Edwards, PhD, who is currently an honorary research fellow with the University of Western Australia. From 2017 to 2023, he was associate professor at
Jönköping.
Gong
Jönköping.
International Business School in Sweden. Prior to that, he was assistant professor at UWA 2009 to 2017, where he had already completed his PhD with distinction in 2008. His main areas of academic interest are meta-studies, business ethics, and organizational sustainability. He has published books and in journals, including Academy of Management, Learning and Education, Business and Society, and Journal of Business Ethics. Before becoming an academic, he was a professional psychologist working with people with disabilities for many years. He is also the secretary of the Western Australian Zen Group and proud parent of two wonderful adult children. Welcome.
Yes. Yes, my beautiful kids. Thank you, Mo. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. I think
Yes, and I should say UWA is the University of Western Australia. So I'm here in Western Australia in Perth. Okay. Beautiful and very warm city of Perth on this summer day.
Yeah, I've always wanted to visit Australia, but it hasn't happened. You happen to be the first person I interview in Australia. That's great.
So it's the first of many.
Hopefully. Before we dive in, I didn't realize you were into Zen. Most of my books are about spirituality, so it's always interesting for me. But that's not the topic today.
I promise not to.
Well, it can be.
It can be. Okay.
Zen has a certain spirit. My thoughts about metatheory and meta-studies is in line with Zen, which is avoiding bloat and unnecessary stuff. Less is more.
Yes.
But I want to start with my first question, which is, how did you get interested in meta-study? And what are meta-studies?
What are they and how did I get into this crazy topic? It's very difficult to say when and where. I've always been a big picture thinker. And I think it's that big picture aspect and feeling connected globally with the whole crazy world that people get themselves into, problems and whatever. So I think it goes way back to childhood, the sense of horizon to horizon as my field of play. After coming home from school, I would go out into the bush, into the landscape, into the countryside. We lived a lot of country towns, going out to creeks and to forests and rivers and playing. So I have that sense of big scale nature. And I also met there big scale destruction of nature. I grew up in Queensland, which probably, other than the Amazon, has been the area in the world that's been most cleared in the last century of forest. So huge agricultural, monocultural grain cropping and so forth, and sheep and cattle pasture. And so I saw firsthand bulldozing of huge areas of countryside. You would have the 50-meter huge chain strung between two bulldozers, just ripping, going through the forest, right? Just ripping down. And Australia's got very fragile soils, so the vegetation is easily removed, right? This was done in massive sort of land areas. So I have this sense of big scale and also of the problems we face, how fragile we are. And so I think and then of course I started reading. I read about the world's problems when I was very young. I started reflecting on these things. I started meditating when I was very young and reading about religion from all over the world, from Europe, from indigenous people, from India, from everywhere, Japan. So I had a sense of things being connected and people having spiritual connection and so forth. And then I think it was like early 80s, I was early 20s, in my early 20s. And I met a very famous Benedictine monk called Father Bede Griffith, who introduced me to the works of Ken Wilber. Bede Griffiths is one of the great spiritual figures, I think, of the 20th century. He's just an amazing person. I met him and had lots of talks with him. Knew him, met him on several occasions. He introduced me to Ken Wilber's thoughts, who he had met in the early 80s. I think Ken had sought him out because of Bede Griffith's writings on connections between East and West. I think he actually wrote a book called East and West, where he joined up spiritualities from Western and Eastern spiritualities and was talking about the connections there. He himself was British. Bede Griffiths was British, but he went to India. He went to a famous town, Tiruvannamalai, where Ramana Maharshi, the great sage of South India, on the holy mountain of Arunachala, and Bede Griffith set up an ashram quite close to there. And so I had started reading Ken Wilber from Bede Griffith's recommendation. This was the early 80s, so like 82, something like that.
But in 82, Integral wasn't so well developed. Was Wilber one?
Wilber had written some really interesting books, Spectrum of Consciousness, No Boundaries, Up from Eden. He'd written some back in the late 70s, very early 80s, had written 4 or 5 very interesting books. And so I followed them as they came out. I saw the development in his ideas. And so I was tuned into how big picture ideas can actually develop and become quite ornate, because, of course, Wilber's ideas started becoming systematized and he applied them to many different disciplines. I was working as a psychologist, so I'm interested in people. And as a psychologist, you can't help but get involved in systems, right? You want to help people, but the systems are stopping them from doing stuff. So you have to work with the system to help people, right? So I started developing system type thinking in organizational work that I was doing. And of course, I had this interest in human development. And then I started doing a master's degree in human development at the University of Western Australia with it's a very eminent organization. It's one of the top universities in Australia. You have to come up with interesting ideas. And so I started reading on the whole scope of human developmental theories and models. And I was reading Wilber at the same time. That was his main field, is human development. He applied it in a whole range of areas. But then I saw that things weren't adding up. I saw that there were theories of human development which were just not covered in Wilber. He never mentioned them. And yet they were very prominent. They were very known within different fields. But Wilber wasn't in academia, although he had very good academic connections. So it was just, there was a mismatch. There was no environmental theories of development. There were no cultural historical activity theory streams of research that went into his work. And I thought, this is problematic. And I thought, I should go back and do a PhD in this and really go back to see what are the roots of this whole topic. And I started thinking about metatheory as a form of research. And I took a year off from work in about 2002, 2003, something like that. And I'd been writing articles and so forth on Wilber. I took a year off and I just put down a whole bunch of ideas and sent them off to Frank Visser. Frank's a wonderful guy, and he put all this stuff up there. And there was quite a booming sort of cottage industry of people writing stuff. They were all labeled as critics, but it wasn't like that at all. They were both just people interested in the ideas and thinking about them. Some people were more critical than others. Some were very supportive. I wanted to cut through the whole stuff of whether Wilber or whatever it was. And so I went back and looked at metatheoretical studies from the beginning. And I found wonderful people like George Ritzer, who's probably the most prominent metatheorist in the social sciences. He's developed many wonderful, the McDonaldization thesis, globalization is nothing theory, wonderful understandings about big picture models of the Earth and the Earth system, particularly the social dimension of that. So that's where Country Boy, B. Griffith, Wilbur, that's all in the mix.
You've highlighted your journey towards metatheory and how you got to study it as part of your PhD. And then in the articles that I read, you mentioned metastudies. So can you tell us the big picture of metastudies as the overarching framework, and then the metatheory? What do you mean by metastudy?
What do we mean by meta? What does meta? Meta is an old word. It's this old Greek word meaning beyond or between. It's a very vague term, which is wonderful because the more vague a term is, the bigger its umbrella. I like vague. Vague is incredibly important for concepts because with vagueness comes inclusion. The more precise you are, the more you have to exclude, right? So, especially with concepts. Meta is this very vague term that has been used to describe big, abstract, multi-dimensional theoretical frameworks, philosophical frameworks, right? And it's been used to apply to various states of the Earth system itself. This is why Facebook changed its name to Meta, because it was cool to see yourself as part of the planetary system and to be like a planetary citizen and all linked with the meta. Unfortunately, I think it's probably introduced some very unnecessary connotations. The commercial aspect, it's like Habermas always talks about the colonization of the life sphere by the commercial sphere, by the economic sphere. And I think everything is chewed up by commerce, business. Yeah, everything's appropriated.
Like mindfulness.
Oh, yeah, the mindfulness industry.
There is a term called McMindfulness, by the way.
Yeah. This is why George Ritzel wrote the McDonaldization thesis. So you could talk about the McDonaldization of Zen for sure. But yes, so meta is this term which is meant to apply this. It was the Greeks used it in many different ways. There's a very interesting term called metaxy, meta-z, XY, that Plato used, that Socrates used, and it means the between which gives birth to everything sort of thing. It's like the missing third. It's that dimension of things which give rise to our capacity to distinguish discrete entities. So like subject.
Is it like emptiness in Buddhism?
Yeah. Yes. It's got that sense. It's got that sense of the creative vacuum. And meta can be used in so many different ways. I use it to designate a clearing of science, a big clear. So science operates at many different levels, but and there's no boundaries to science. Everything, I don't think every topic is open to scientific inquiry. I don't think there are. The issue is, what are the ethical products of that inquiry? That's where we need to think about. Seymour Saracen wrote this wonderful essay that had this beautiful title, If It Can Be Studied, Should It? And I think there's a lot of things in science that we don't need to study.
Yeah.
I have got big problems with science studying hyper technologies, extreme forms of grandiose technologies, spending billions and billions on things where, for example, a fusion energy. I think this researching fusion energy that's the Frankenstein of science, right? Because plentiful, cheap energy, what that means for the planet is the destruction of the planet. It's not going to solve anything. It's Pandora's box. So all those poor, ambitious scientists who are trying to create the fusion engine, I think they're like the magician's apprentice who's going to release torrents of turmoil because
Release the Kraken.
yeah, because the last thing we need is zero cost energy. If we have zero cost energy, if every factory's got its own little fusion engine producing countless unending capacities for energy, that means we'll transform more of the earth into more plastic bits of stuff, more anthropocentric heaps of stuff, which we've got too much already, right?
Yes.
The earth has limits. Limitless energy is a disaster on a planet that's full of limits. And so those kinds of hyper technologies, people should not be spending their lives chasing the tiger tail of fusion energy. But I'm sorry.
Very good segue. So do meta studies help deal with that question?
I think they do, because there's important ethical dimension to meta studies. Every scientific approach comes with its own a priori models about what exists, its ontological assumptions, models about how we know that, its epistemological assumptions, and values, its axiological assumptions that come with the whole package. And meta studies, as a broad philosophical and scientific idea, and they're different, they are very different, is about the process of raising consciousness about the scientific process itself, understanding what we are doing and why we are doing it, and why do we ask this question? Why don't we ask this other question? So when you survey a landscape, you get a big picture view of what's happening, and it gives you a better capacity to choose which pathways you want to travel and which you don't, which ones lead to a cliff and which ones lead to a nicer place to build a nice little place to do your work, right? And so those choices are value laden, and they emerge with the process of doing scientific work, and especially in flowery of meta studies, which for me is meta theoretical. It's meta methodologies, big pictures about methods. It's big pictures about how we learn from our research, the hermeneutics, how we interpret the findings, and big pictures about the data, so metadata. So like every discipline has these forms of meta. For example, in health studies, there's 100,000 studies on the efficacy of vaccines, right? And so people publish metadata analysis where they bring together all these and they see how they can be compared and where they can't. And they come up with estimates of the main effects of the drugs and so forth, right? They do systematic reviews, right? So that's metadata analysis. There are systems that look at how we put together different methods. There's multi-methods, mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods that are joined up into, for example, qualitative comparative analysis. A wonderful new method is balancing both quantitative and qualitative approaches. It's an amazing new method by Charles Reagan, a really methodologist. So bringing together different methods, that's called meta-methodology. When you look at the whole field and you look at all the different methods and you say, and good scientists should know lots of different methods because different research questions require different methods to answer them. So a good researcher will have a good idea of what's out there, both quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. I think Mingus is a great mixed methods guy in systems research, organizational research. And then there's meta meanings. How do we interpret and make sense? And what interpretive systems do we bring to bear on the findings, on different aspects of the research? And that's the hermeneutics, the sense-making, the meaning-making aspect. And when you look at the different systems, that's more of a philosophical element of science. But there's lots of different philosophies, right? So you need meta there to also look across different things and see where they support each other, where there's gaps and strengths and whatever. And meta theory is about obviously constructing these systems of ideas which make a truth claim. So a theory is a system of concepts and ideas that are in relationship, which make a truth claim, right? Metatheories just do that where their data is not empirical research. Their data is the next level up. It's middle range research, right? And that way we can start to assemble and compare and contrast the great history and heritage of ideas that's gone before us. We don't have to keep creating the wheel. We can see, oh, this guy had a wonderful theory of change in organizations. This guy did as well, but this guy did too. Hey, there happened to be about 40 or 50 or maybe 100 theories of organizational change and transformation. What happens if we look at all of them? Which elements do they share? Which ones do they uniquely contribute? And so when we do that, we start recognizing the history of ideas and thought, and we can start building on that immense wealth of tradition that our sciences and philosophies and our thinking, and I include Indigenous science here as well. I'm not just talking about some sort of airy-fairy Western thing. Science is a planetary activity. We talk about the European Enlightenment. I think there was a global enlightenment where science is a natural expression of the human desire to come to grips with the mystery of life. That's what science is. A wonderful mystic, Hildegard of Bingen, wrote a book called Schedius, and this means the science of the ways, knowledge of the ways. She wrote this in the 11th century or something, right? And so we've always had this huge thirst and hunger for trying to work out this mysterious world we're living in. We look down at our feet and we see little rocks and stones and little creatures, and we look up above our heads and there's the immensity of the heavens. So with one little look, you can move from the smallest of little bits and pieces of analytical stuff to the whole mystery and the whole entire temporal scale of the universe. When you open your eyes, you're getting light from billions of years ago when the universe was young. So you're getting a picture just by moving your head 180 degrees, right? We go from the smallest, most particulate thing to the most whole, most general thing. And the human brain, as Ian McGilchrist has wonderfully talked about, is built to keep these two elements, the particular and the general, in mind all the time. Is because, and that's why we've got hemispheres, right?
Yes.
We've got hemispheres because the brain has to do two tasks, essentially, at the same time. It can't do them sequentially. It has to be in parallel. And that's why our brain is in parallel, hemispherically in parallel. We must focus on the particular, on the detail, and at the same time, focus on the whole, right? We have to focus on the detail in order to find food, in order to deal with this particular crisis, in order to attend to this particular person, to look them in the eye, to build shelter, to meet our needs. But we have to do all of that while not getting eaten, by being aware of predators, of conditions, of big landscapes, and know where we are in the landscape. So this empirical science, if you like, is, or our data, if you like, the data that we're working with is the attention on the detail, and our attention on the whole is the theoretical aspect. Now, the thing is that data and theory, it's a sliding relationship. Sometimes the data is empirical, right? But sometimes the data can be conceptual and it can be other theories. And so what we mean by theory then shifts. And it shifts from being an empirical theory to a middle range theory to meta theory. And so when our data is other ideas, when our data is other theories, what we are doing is meta theorizing. We are doing meta studies. We include the method, the interpretation, the data aspect, and the theorizing aspect. All of that wraps up into a meta studies, right? And that understanding is not very well established.
Okay. So a long time ago, maybe 2014, I don't know if this long time ago, you wrote an article about misunderstandings of meta theory. So which of these misunderstandings persist to this day?
So I think all of them are worse today than they were. I really have not seen much development in understanding of the science of meta theory or the science of meta studies in its most general sort of form. There's been a lot of work in philosophy, I would say. And philosophy is very different to science. In science, the data rules the day. You come up with nice little explanations based on the data. Sometimes they're nonsense. The data tells you all swans are white, and then you come across a black swan. It blows your theory completely out. You have to come up with a whole new understanding of nature. And so in science, the reliance on patterns in the data as arguments, right? And this is why method is so particularly important in science, because your method, and why it's so important that it's transparent, that it's public, that's publicly validated, that you have peer-to-peer engagement, why blinding of research submissions has to be blinded. No one knows the status of the author. And I have got huge respect for the top scientific journals, and for the ranking system. I think it's very valid. It's too narrow, and we should have other ways of testing a researcher's impact. And we should value books much more than we do. Books, people find it very strange when they say that academics who write books are a dying breed. They only do it when they're retired or something, or in the sunset of their careers. And that's because the pressure to publish in top journals is so immense, and it's crazy. Nonetheless, it's an extremely valid activity, right? It is. Those top journals in any field are fantastic scientific publications. The work that goes into them and the knowledge that goes into them is extraordinary. People who've never touched that sort of sphere of activity have no idea of the level of knowledge and focus and attention and skill and creativity that goes into that research. And
I want to interject here. I have 3 anthologies, and now I'm guest editing for a top 3% journal. And what I've found is that it's very easy so it's an emerging topic, and I could have rejected every single article of the 18 articles that were submitted. We decided to keep 8 of them and then worked very hard developing them before they went to the peer review. And most editors are not willing to do that. But because I was already a book editor, anthology editor before, I was able to, with my guest co-editor, to upgrade the level of scholarship that they kind of were accepted with revisions or without revisions into the journal. So I think this being unpaid work, this is probably why editors resist doing it.
it is recompensed. It's regarded as part of your academic work to do that sort of service, but it's not exactly volunteer. I wouldn't say it's volunteer, but a collegial service that you provide. And it is voluntary in some degree because you can just say no. But then I think it's so important that we contribute to the institutional activities like that. But so I got fed up with writing short form ideas. I published in very good journals, but I wanted to write books. And so I've moved now out of academia in order to do that a little bit more, to write bigger scale stuff and to apply some of these ideas to the globe. Like, I think we need, in the same way that we've got an Earth system environmental science, we've got the planetary boundaries frameworks, we've got big scale data collection about the atmosphere, about the oceans, about all the biomes and the tipping points across the planet. And we've got these massive global systems of environmental science telling us what the state of the planet is. But we do have some fledgling sort of starts of things on the social science side, but nothing really encompassing the world of ideas. It's like the noosphere concept, Teilhard de Chardin, the old noosphere idea of the layering of ideas and systems of ideologies and the stories, the big picture stories we tell ourselves, which really do govern the planet in a major way. Certainly the economic big picture meta theories of growth and of competition and of markets and of productivity and of international trade and of tariffs and systems of collaboration at the economic level. Those big systems have massive impact on the physical nature of the planet. And this is one of the most important aspects of meta theories. Meta theories are performative, and it's not in the pejorative sense. There's two meanings of this word performative. One is like to be a hypocrite or something, you're just performing something. The other notion is much more sophisticated, and it comes from the work of philosophers like John Austin, Judith Butler. This is the notion that ideas actually change the physical world. So an example would be, you've got an idea about how you want your garden to be. And you sit down one day and you start designing it on a page. You want a garden bed here, you want a nice little feature there, a little breakfast table here, and you're going to put this tree over here because it's going to grow 10 meters, but you're going to grow smaller things here. So you design it, right? And then you go off and do it. And hey, presto, 2 years later, your garden looks like the idea you had. And then that's not the end of it. That's the enactive arc of performativity. But there's also what's called the interpretive arc. This is that the garden changes who you are. So you design and build your garden, and then you start to sit in it. You start to reflect. You start to have coffee out there with your friends. And they say, isn't this lovely? And you start to enjoy your life a little bit more. And you relax a little bit because you've got now a beautiful garden. And so you settle down into the garden, and the garden changes the way you feel about your life, right? And so that's the performative, what's called the performative cycle, where ideas are enacted in the world and create spaces and create systems. And those systems change the ideas. They change who you think you are. They change identities. They change behaviors. And it's for this reason that the great economist, John Maynard Keynes, in the early 30s, he wrote this great meta theory called the general theory of money and interest. Or was it employment? But it was, the thing I always focus on was he called it the general theory. It's a meta theory. And in the end, at the end of that book, it's one of the most quoted quotes of any book about meta theory. He said, some people say that these big ideas are just abstract, airy-fairy building castles in the air. I say that every one of you live by the ideas of some dead economist, right?
Marx, for example, until communism fell.
Even when they're bad, even when they're false, they still have this impact in the world, right? They don't have to be true to have this impact. They just have to be believed. Conspiracy theories across the world can be based on the most ridiculous nonsense. Sometimes there's a kernel of truth, but sometimes there's nonsense. And what happens? The Holocaust happens because so many people believed the nonsense. The Elders of Zion, that book, that
The
fictitious
protocols of the Elders
Yeah.
of Zion.
Yeah. And so people started believing all this stuff was true. So this is one reason why media is such a crucial issue in metatheoretical studies, how we communicate the relationships between reality and between the beliefs and the stories that people tell about it. I'm weaving several.
So you've mentioned these meta theories, economics or whatever political systems. The way I see meta theories, one is domain specific, meaning economics, politics, leadership, and then transdomain, which covers many domains like integral theory, Roy Bhaskara's critical realism. So do we need more meta theories, whether domain specific or transdomain? Do we need more? Or is there a different problem than the number of meta theory?
Do we need more science?
It depends. If we're not applying the science, do we really need more science? So people know smoking is bad. They just keep smoking.
If humanity didn't do science anymore, would that be good or bad?
On average, I'd say bad, but there is knowing gap.
It's the same with meta studies. It's a core part of all science. I'm not into building these big Tower of Babel type views of meta theoretical systems. I'm not into that. I think it can be very counterproductive because sometimes these big ideas like Wilber's stuff is built on very poor foundations. Some of his foundational propositions were not solidly grounded. For example, he left out a lot of theories of human development. He just didn't cover them. So there are some lenses that we could, what I call metatheoretical lenses or meta lenses, which are not present. The whole Vygotskian mediation lens, which is Vygotsky was inherited a completely different tradition of understanding what caused human behavior. Piaget came out of a positivist tradition, and that morphed into his clinical method, and he developed a very individualist understanding of development, whereas Vygotsky was all culture. He saw development as a result of social mediation, not of the unfolding of internal structures. And so you've got very different, and Wilber doesn't have any of Vygotsky in his framework. So there's a lot of stuff in Wilber which reflects the culture he grew up in. Individualist, achievement-focused American culture, and even the stuff that he imported and brought in from India. India can be a very individualist culture as well, and their understanding of their philosophical base is huge. And I think we forget that India has got a whole range of materialist, pragmatic philosophies and sciences as well. It's not just all spiritual sort of dualistic solipsism stuff that's coming out of India. They've got a massive tradition in materialism and in behavioral science. No meta theory can bring in all this stuff. So what I am much more interested in is we have a problem. What can meta theory contribute to this problem? Don't start with the meta theory and then think that meta theory can solve every problem. Start with the problem and the people affected by it and the host community, and have in your toolkit a whole range of different meta-theoretical lenses, and you say which ones are relevant, because some of them won't be, and which ones are valid, because some meta-theoretical lenses are not particularly people have been doing this stuff forever. The first humans were metatheorists. They had to be. They had to connect different theories of where to find food, how to build stuff, how to escape predators, of how to achieve their lusts for travel and for journey and seeing new landscapes. One of the great metatheoretical periods in human history was in the Abyssinian Caliphate in
Iraq,
Baghdad. Huh?
Yes, Baghdad in Iraq.
Yes, Iraq, Persia, and or the Middle East, because the Arabs went off fighting and conquering. And when after they'd done all that violence and conquered all this stuff, the Abyssinian Caliphate said, I want all of the books of wisdom of the world brought to Baghdad and translated. This was around 8th, 9th century. So Baghdad at the time was the biggest city in the world, first city on the planet, I think, with more than 1 million people. And all of these books from China, from India, from North Africa, from Greece, Greek philosophers, the Hindu number system, the Persian astronomers and astrologers as well. All this stuff was brought, the books were brought and they were translated. And in that process of translation into Arabic, because they all had to be put into Arabic, right? The different theories had to be resolved. So these great people who study this stuff are always amazed at the polymathic abilities of these 9th, 10th, 11th century Islamic scientists, right? They had to compare Aristotelian theories of optics with Hindu theories of optics with Arabic theory. And so they were meta-theorists. They had to test which of these middle range theories, how do we integrate them? And so they developed a scientific method in its most formal sense. So they wrote out first a catalogued scientific method system for the deductive testing of hypotheses and inductive generation of evidence. And so this is called the first translation movement. All this stuff being translated, and it was a huge meta-theoretical splurge that generated immense knowledge. And it was because of this first translation movement that when the Mongolians invaded Iraq and they destroyed Baghdad in the 12th century, and they scattered all this, they burnt the House of Wisdom, the first universities that were built, and all of this knowledge was scattered, pushed into the West. So all the knowledge and books were that retained and developed in Western Islamic society in Andalusia, and Toledo became this great house of learning. And the monks in the 12th, 13th century from Northern Europe came down and studied in these places. And King Frederick in Sicily opened up his kingdom to these scholars, and it went into Italy, and this gave birth to the Renaissance. And all of this cross-fertilization was just a part of this universal understanding and love of big pictures that people have always had. And we've been meta-theorists from the beginning. This is nothing new. And so what's new is to formalize it, to institutionalize it, to methodology, to make it systematic, with method.
Methodology. We've talked about the past, how we've been doing meta theory forever. I want to fast forward to today. What does the field of meta theory need right now? And where do you see the future?
Big pictures are required because we live in a big universe. And big pictures depend on middle range and little pictures because our big universe depends on the human scale and the atomic scale. And so the whole scope needs to be understood as essential for dealing with the big picture problems that we have today. Let me hit you, Mo, with a little idea. How about we take a long-term lens on the history of the planet over the last, let's say, 150 years or so, and bring to our understanding of what happened. We're in this metacrisis at the moment. All the different individual things like atmospheric climate change, wars, atomic bombs, economic stuff happening, oceans being polluted, AI going crazy. So we're faced by this planet in crisis, right? The metacrisis is all of that, plus we don't know what resources to use to solve. We don't feel we've got the resource. We haven't got the sense, the meaning-making capacities to make sense of all of this. That's the metacrisis. It's not just the cocktail of anthropogenic problems. It's the fact that we don't know how we caused it, and we don't know how to get ourselves out of it. The best we can come up is to fly to Mars and set up a colony. That's an example of the hyper-technology nonsense that I detest, right? We've got this metacrisis. So how about this? Let's take this meta-historical, macro-historical view. At the end of the 19th century, there was a global depression. You had nations all over the world starting to form their own constitutions and identify with their own national, ethnic boundaries and formalizing those boundaries. You had them lining up with different empires because you still had the British, Russian, Ottoman, in some ways, Austro-Hungarian. You had empires, and you had the whole colonial system, which had been happening for hundreds of years. And then you've got this globe that's really starting to vibrate with a bunch of allegiances and emerging issues, and it cracks into the First World War. And the First World War cracks into the Russian Revolution. And because of the First World War and the movement of soldiers, we get the Spanish pandemic, flu, where tens of millions of people died. Maybe as many as were killed in the whole First World War in the warfare itself. Then you move into these social crises of inflation, unemployment, and you get the Great Depression happening. That triggers off the Second World War with its Holocaust and with every country on the planet affected. You had millions of American soldiers going to Europe and to Pacific and being brutalized and traumatized, and then all going back home. The same here in Australia. Every country for the first 50, 60 years of the 20th century was unending trauma. And every generation, and we still live with it in many ways. When they went back home and the end of the war, you had the United Nations, you had systems of defense, you had NATO, and this sort of localized wars did come, but they were localized. So you had this global calming down, but you still had all the trauma. How did people deal with the trauma? Everyone went back to work. Everyone went back and started earning money, secure the futures of their family, their children. And we all started theorizing about systems of production and growth and consumption. And we created shopping centers and malls in which people could become consumers. And we had global trade, and we had energy sources that would feed all that. And so the first half of the 20th century was the great trauma. The second half of the 20th century was the great acceleration. This is the period when all of the socioeconomic indicators of growth just go through the roof, right? And all the environmental indicators of health and stability and resilience take a big exponential dive down, right? This kicks off all of the sustainability crisis, climate change, and its growth, and it's the desire to secure growth and for everyone to have their own little affluent kingdom. That has kicked off the metacrisis. From a meta-theoretical point of view, how does this story of trauma leading to the strategy of consumption and production unending as a way of securitization, right? The strategy of global securitization. And now that's caused all these environmental and socioeconomic problems, which are destroying all of that old world. They're destabilizing things like the war in Syria was very much amplified. It wasn't the only cause, but it was amplified by climate change because we had this massive period of dry rainfall from 2007 to 2011 was the driest period in Middle Eastern history. And that fed directly into the Syrian war. The Syrian war, millions of refugees going into Europe, that kicks off the whole right-wing movement in Sweden and throughout and starts global destabilization, right? So metatheory is a way of looking at all of these and how to link them up and how to theorize them. How should we deal with trauma collectively? What are the metatheories of trauma resolution that might apply here? How can we deal when we have a strategy that becomes a vicious cycle? How do we get ourselves out of it? There's lots of metatheories that deal with different theories of conflict and how to resolve them, right? There's different theories of growth, degrowth, A growth, standard growth model. So we've got all these different theories of growth. Let's develop a meta-theoretical approach to these to bring out their strengths and weaknesses to see which ones we can apply to solve some of these issues. How do we connect up economics with social, with environmental, with governance? How do we link all these such that planetary boundaries are not transgressed? We've got 9 planetary systems on the planet which keep the planet stable. 6 of them are in the uncertain zone at the very least, which are destabilizing planetary systems. And the problem with climate change and all of these planetary processes is not the biggest problem with all of these, is the political disorder and the social disorder that they generate. Every year, there's about 12 million people displaced by climate change, but about 10 million of them are displaced internally within the country. It doesn't cause any great disturbances so much, really, although Syria, it does, and in Central America, it does, which is one of the causes for all the asylum seekers on the southern border of America, which is why Trump gets a lot of support, is because climate change dislocates those populations, causes political disruption, and they have to escape. This is going to get much worse. And unless we connect up the social, economic, environmental, and the governance understandings of these things meta-theoretically, in terms of meta-studies, in terms of our big picture thinking, we're going to be subject to these problems and we're not going to be masters of them.
So we went over time. Any closing words? What do you wish you did different? Where do you see the future? Any parting remarks?
I could go on. I'm sorry to go over time.
That's fine with me.
Look, I see this stuff as an essential aspect. Science is not the only thing that's going to get us out of this, and it may not even be the most important. That's where I can contribute. And I see our scientific institutions are critical, absolutely critical. In a world where you don't know who to believe, science becomes more important, not less. So maybe that can be my last little.
So, Mark, it was a pleasure to have you, and I'd love to continue the
Mark.
conversation at some point.
Look, I'd love to keep in contact with you because I've been looking at your material and you're doing some very fine work. So I want to applaud efforts to get these big picture understandings out there and current really wonderful work that you do. So congratulations on all of that.
Thank you. And thank you again for being on this episode of the podcast.
Thank you.